Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode, another show of the Created in the Image of God, exploring the role of religion in society. I'm your host, Wade Fransson. I'm here again with Stammgäste, with our regular guests, Daniel Sanderson from up north in the frozen white wasteland, and Jafar Falahi down in, I always forget, is it North or South Carolina?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. And me right in the middle, in between the two, here in Brooklyn, Wisconsin. Welcome. We're going to continue on the theme that we've been covering and unpacking, which is the application of the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was created and adopted in 1948. We have correlated this Declaration of Human Rights to the broad arc of history. We showed a video a couple of episodes ago that covered off on that and showed how this has been a struggle throughout human history to try to achieve a level of fairness and equity that could be applied consistently to all peoples in the effort of pursuing a more just and a more righteous and a more decent species of humanity. In our previous episodes, we also explored how there's a correlation, in my view, this is my own fantasy speculation here, to the parable in Matthew about the Son of Man coming in his glory to judge the nations, and how this document represents the method by which nations have chosen to judge themselves. And earlier in the book of Matthew, in chapter 7, we are told not to judge. And Jesus tells us that by whatever measure of judgment we mete out, that is the same measure by which we will be judged. And my hypothesis is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights represents humankind's, the fellowship of nations' decision by which to judge themselves. And thus it is a fulfillment of both parts of Matthew. One, the fact that by whatever judgment we judge, that is how we will be judged. And then the Son of Man returning in his glory, sitting on his throne and proceeding to actually then judge the nations. And to me, it was eerily consistent to read the criteria in Matthew chapter 25 by which that judgment takes place and correlate it to the criteria in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not to mention that the prophecies that talk about this include that image about the plowman beating his sword into plowshares, which is prominently featured in front of the United Nations, around which time all of this came about. In the wake of World War II, one of the greatest tragedies in human history of people not getting along and killing each other in war, and then determining a better path forward. So, long-winded intro to bring you up to speed in the first 3 minutes of where we're at. We're going to once again look at a quick video. We're going to just watch a couple of minutes of it to sort of introduce the establishment of that Universal Declaration. And in that video, it then begins to illustrate what some of them are. Once those individual human rights are explained, we'll then pause the video and begin to discuss them. We hope you're tuning in on Facebook. We hope you're tuning in on YouTube. We hope you'll participate in the comment section. We hope that you'll like and subscribe, because we're really excited about the inputs that we've been having and how that has triggered additional insight, discussion, and understanding on our part. And while I tee up the video, I don't know, Daniel or Jafar, if you have anything you wish to add to that introduction.
Jafar?
I just think it's kind of nice and interesting to put the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the context of religious and biblical prophecy. It's just a different way of looking at things, and it makes religion, I feel like, more secular or something, maybe more palatable. I don't know if that's true, but that's just a thought that ran through my head.
Well, and by secular, I assume you mean even accessible or more broad-reaching, or more impactful, more direct. Because making it secular may not seem like a good thing.
I wasn't going there with that Wade. Do I have an echo?
I'm not hearing it.
I hear it also.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, still there. Anyways, I actually really appreciated hearing that as well. I'm not someone that I guess actively looks for the correlations between Matthew and documents like this. But I think that really puts on really demonstrates for Wade his value, part of his value, his wisdom. And this part I really agree with is that if you look at an origin and how sequentially our human thought has changed over time, what religion represents is an earlier version of everything. How we conceive the world. It contains our hopes, dreams, aspirations, everything. For a snapshot of a particular culture. What's interesting about looking at the big picture of this declaration, what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that again this is our best attempt. Now, when you compare the two, and we see where we're actually going with this, it's a fascinating way to look at progress. And we can call that prophecy too.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate that. Well, go ahead and roll this video. And again, this is from, I forget the name of the website, but I think it's an official website that describes the history and all the documents pertaining to and related to this declaration at the United Nations in December 1948. Here we go.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?
After World War II, it was clear that the horrors of the war should never be allowed to occur again. Founded in 1945, the United Nations sought to prevent future atrocities by affirming, in its foundational charter, faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and a commitment to promote better standards of life in larger freedom. In the years that followed, member states of the United Nations strived to develop the human rights provisions of the Charter and capture them in a single document. It took 3 years to agree on a common vision. On the 10th of December, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations.
Still, it is the first step in a great evolutionary process. It is the first occasion on which the organised community of nations has made a declaration of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it has the authority of the body of opinion of the United Nations as a whole. And millions of people, men and women and children all over the world, will turn for hope and guidance and inspiration to this document.
While history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration before us may be destined to occupy an honorable place in the procession of positive landmarks in human history.
Let's just pause there for a second, actually. And Daniel, I think this gets a little bit to what you were saying earlier in segueing into this about this document, the way that religion, captures and conveys the hopes and aspirations. And, you were saying it much more eloquently than I am now.
Well. I mean, and the point here comparing with Charles's quote, while history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration will be destined to occupy an honorable place in the possession of human landmarks in the human history. I mean, It's really interesting. It is the document that we produce. And if repeat listeners know my history, they know that I spend a lot of time with Plato. And right now I'm thinking Plato's laws. And I'm thinking that one of the developments of the laws is to push something onto society, even if it's not immediately true, but it binds society. It helps you judge yourself by your own commitment. Right? I try to equate that to if you had an employee or something and you said, okay, so what do you want to do for work for the next 6 months? What do you think is the most valuable thing to do? And they say, well, I can do this and this and this and this, and then you say, okay, go and do it. But they're going to be held accountable to what they put forward there, right? And so what can you accomplish? Well, I think they can accomplish this. So the very interesting thing about this worldwide document, or this world document, is that it's binding us to something that, and we can argue how much binding is actually taking place here, right? But it's attempting to bind us through common language. Somebody who's got a theological background might say, I see the correlation like Wade does. Somebody else might push back and say, no, it's not, it's not from the Bible. It's not from the Quran. It's, I don't agree with it. I can focus more on the ancient books instead of using this. And I think it's it's a perversion that we're actually trying to rely on something so contemporary and man-made. So it's interesting. I think religion can take both sides.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was getting at when I said that I appreciate Wade's connection to the Bible with the Declaration of Human Rights.
Did you anticipate it in any other way other than what you had described, Wade?
Well, my personal fascination is I believe the Bible is the Word of God, and it's a trustworthy guide. It has been my whole life. I find it to be inerrant, right? Scripture can be trusted. And therefore, I look around me and I try to make sense of my world from that perspective. I openly declare that bias. I'm open to anyone, telling me that I'm a fool, that I'm deceived, that I'm ignorant and naive, whatever. Because I'm happy to have that discussion, right? But for me, it is important that the Bible is coherent. So, perhaps I'm grasping at straws to try to make it fit. But that's why I appreciate this discussion with somebody coming from a completely different perspective to say, Wade, I don't see it that way. I think it's a stretch, but I can see what you're getting at, and it has a degree of coherence, right? Whether or not that's what Jesus was talking about, whether or not whoever recorded those words, 2,000 some years ago, actually had a understanding that at some point in human history such a declaration would be made. Yeah, it's an interesting correlation, right? And I'm looking for, rather than looking at ways in which we can prove somebody else wrong, I'm looking for ways in which we can reach a common vision. Daniel, you and I had some talk about that after the show recently, or maybe it was part of it was during a show or after a show, where you're also working towards giving people a common motivation to come closer in their views and to be more cooperative and to reach alignment in terms of producing an improvement to the common good, and not looking to do so in a way that, becomes dogmatic. This also gets back to, what we've talked about in the last few shows about not being coercive, right? This has to capture the hearts, minds, and imaginations of people so that they wish to do it, so that they wish to sign up for the project, so that they actually say, you know what, however they see it in a Muslim country, it's fine. They've signed up for this, and we in a Christian country, and we in a secular country, and we in a Buddhist country, we all sign up for this common standard.
And the common standard you're bringing back to the Declaration of Human Rights, you mean?
Exactly.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I mean, I have. Can I say the word Baha'i on the show? Is that?
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
That, okay. So I have the layman understanding of the Baha'i faith. I really, what I've glanced through on a Wikipedia page is about all I know. Mm-hmm. So, right, but to me, it seems like one of its defining characteristics is that it's a unifying theory of all the world's religions. And what you just said, does that resonate with the Baha'i faith?
Absolutely. What's interesting, though, and I'll actually try to screen share. Well, I'll just refer to it because I'm going to then share a different item. It just going back and forth between screen sharing takes precious seconds away from our wonderful discourse. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and he sits down to judge the nations, and then he judges them, he doesn't say anything about whether or not they accept him. What's fascinating to me, and I began to study this, a couple of decades ago, and I gave a sermon on this in Estonia when as a guest of the United Church of God, of which I was not technically a member at that time. But it was part of the splinter groups that had come out of the Worldwide Church of God, and now they were bickering, squabbling fragments. But in a stroke of uncharacteristic magnanimity and ecumenicism amongst our splinter groups, I was invited to give a sermon because I had been the first pastor of that church when I lived in Germany. And I chose this passage in Matthew 25 specifically because both the sheep and the goats had something in common that I hadn't noticed before. Both the sheep and the goats, when Christ, the returning King, the Son of Man, told them, hey, you're a goat and you're a sheep, and here's why. And he said, it's because when you saw me thirsty, you either did or did not give me a drink of water. You saw me hungry, you either did or did not feed me. You saw me naked, you either did or did not clothe me. You saw me in prison, and you either did or did not come to visit me. Those are the four criteria by which he judged them. Did you or did you not help me? Both the sheep and the goat says, we never saw you. So it was not about whether or not you recognized the Son of Man. Ergo, it had nothing to do with whether you declared or identified as a Christian. It had nothing to do with whether you professed to be a follower of Christ. They didn't even recognize him.
Doesn't that feel good to find a piece of the scripture that you think hasn't been illuminated? I mean, that's got to feel great.
I live for that, right? But then again, I'm just one whacked out guy with his ideas, and I do not, for the record, I do not believe that I have special divine insight, right? I'm just a guy like anybody else who is reading it and believing when Jesus said, knock and it shall be opened, ask and it shall be given. I believe you can come to an understanding. And I was really searching for it for me. I wasn't looking for this to try to preach at others. I wanted to know, how can I be a sheep and not a goat? I mean, I don't want to be a goat. And I was going through some crisis, with all this splintering. I was a minister in this denomination that had this hermetically sealed belief system. We talked about hermetically sealed belief systems on another show. And suddenly our fundamental beliefs were challenged, and it split us down the middle, and some went to the left, some went to the right. And our claim to unity as a characteristic of who we were and that we loved one another, whatever that got us in terms of our professions of virtue, suddenly that carpet was pulled out from under us because we were hypocrites. We were not able to live up to the standards we professed. And it wasn't just obvious to some of us, it was obvious to the watching eyes of the world, to the degree that anyone cared to watch. Even if we ourselves couldn't see it, other people could clearly see our hypocrisy. And I was aware of it. So I'm searching the scriptures and saying, what should I do? Am I a goat? I don't want to be a goat. I want to be on the right track. I want to be right with God. So I was searching these verses for understanding of my own situation, and that's when I came upon this understanding, and I tried to share it with others. Some were receptive, some were not. But to the point of this show, I believe, yes, it does speak to that Baha'i ideal of the oneness of humanity and the oneness of religion, but Jesus himself speaks to it, right? I could point to many other examples of this same thing in the teachings of Jesus, even though many see in his teachings a degree of exclusivity, and I understand why they see that, and claims to, ultimate authority, which I understand and accept. I call him Lord as well. But there is this ability that his teachings have to embrace all people. And those are also very clear in that. And so, all of that very much speaks to the nature of this universal declaration of human rights, or what Jafar called the secularization of it. I also have come to see it in terms of that prophecy, I believe it's in Jeremiah, where it says he will come and he will magnify the law and make it honorable. And I used to think that this was speaking to the fact that Jesus said, all the law can be summed up in this: love God and love your fellow man. But that's not actually a magnification, that's a condensation, right? So that's not what it's talking about, in my opinion. The magnification comes from the fact that it is now universally applied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it has been made honorable amongst all the peoples, even those from wherever they come from. So again, I see these correlations in the Bible because I believe the Bible has real, meaningful, impactful relevance for our day and age today. And if we take it seriously, it's an unfathomable mine of richness. But you don't have to, because the world is moving forward and evolving under the gentle guiding hand of our Creator to help us grow and mature as a species, as has always been the case.
Here, Wade, this is how I'll tell you how it'll become prophetic. And right move to claim humility on that. It's very virtuous to be able to do that. But how this becomes divine and divinity, a definition of divinity or an instance of divinity, will unfold naturally, as you say, with God's hand. Now, what that really means from a secular standpoint is that there is a natural unfolding of the way the world is going to unfold, right? A progression in life that just is inevitable, right? Essentially, what you're saying is that we're moving towards this more dignified acceptance of the human individual, I would say, right? And that is inevitable. And the reason why I say that what you're saying could be prophetic is because if this becomes more and more obvious to the community and beyond that this is what is happening, right? And more people say that this is what is happening, it will in itself start to perpetuate. And naturally, if people communicate what they've heard and seen from Wade, that's an important part of having that attribution of prophet or saying something prophetic, right? I know you don't want it. He's like, I don't want to be a...
No, I don't have it. It's not... Yeah, no.
No, but you don't know. You don't know how... If you accept and surrender to the Lord, then you cannot say for certain that He has not chosen you for that path, and that this is what's happening. You can't say it's impossible for you to make that claim. Unless you're being dishonest with yourself.
No, to not be disingenuous. One of the goals that I have, and I would share, I think, this with all religious people, is to become a hollow reed, to allow the power and the Spirit of God to flow through oneself, right? To not get in the way of what God can and wishes to do through you, whether with your, awareness or consciousness, or simply pursuing the good, however you see it or perceive it.
Right, but we're missing a fine distinction of the only thing that I was trying to say. If right now Wade is the only one waving the flag and saying this, and even members in your community are like, Wade, you're crazy. That's nuts. That's just too crazy for us, right?
Right.
Who invited him to the Christmas party, right? This is
Right.
weird. He's just, we don't want him to be involved because he's just making up stories, right?
Right.
But then, before your death, people are like, wait a minute, I think Wade's got something here, right? And it gains a momentum in culture. And if it takes on a shape of its own, if people see that string of virtue that goes through history and say, there's wisdom in this, this is very valuable, this is worth defining our species around. Thank you, Wade, that was great. It's happened. It's not. It sounds ridiculous because you're like, no, wait.
Well, absolutely no. But again, for clarity, the idea that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has prophetic significance is not new. It is not mine. I received that from somebody else, and I actually kind of resisted it, but it led to further exploration. I think I've never heard anyone else connect it to Matthew 25, and
well, there it is, right there,
and give it that degree of clarity. But for me, that's how I came to accept it, because I initially said, yeah, that's an interesting document, but I don't think it has that weight. But now I see, in my view, that it does because of the correlation with Matthew 25. And there are some other things that we might eventually get into that I've sort of tacked onto this, or how I came to it, that I can share at some future point as we unpack all this. But I think enough about me. My views. This quote by Habib Malik, if that's the Charles Habib Malik, triggered that. The document itself, it wasn't known to what degree it would or wouldn't be widespread, adopted, have impact. And in fact, its importance in the consciousness has, I think, ebbed and flowed over time. I think it might be coming back into focus after having receded out of focus, as the world, lurches forward from ditch to ditch. Now, that is a saying that I hadn't heard anybody else. That's a Franssonism as well. We lurch forward from ditch to ditch, for what it's worth. But we'll go ahead and play a little bit more of this video. Were you guys getting the audio on that?
I don't hear you.
I paused it. Were you getting the audio?
No.
Okay. Let me scroll back and try that again. Sorry. You have to do it a certain way. You have to click your heels 3 times and say, "There's no place like home."
The Declaration consists of a preamble and 30 articles, with Article 1 powerfully proclaiming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
And there we pause, because that's the first article, and it brings up a word that you mentioned, Daniel, which is dignity. And I love how it continues here. They endowed with reason and conscience and act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Jafar or Daniel, what are your thoughts on that first article?
Well, I can go. Well, And Wade, do you want me to talk about dignity at all?
Yes, please.
I've been having a bit of a problem with dignity, actually. Not necessarily the way it's been laid out in this document, which I'm not entirely familiar with how they're defining dignity in this document. But I know I've been reading a philosopher by the name of Robert Hanna, and he's contributed to Planck's, and he's got a paper on dignity. Now, he's a recognized Kant scholar, and he's a very good technical writer. This is my formation of him right now. He's a really good technical writer, but when you read this paper, I think it even took me a couple passes to get kind of into the meat of it, right? Like into the meaning of what he was trying to string together. And sometimes, if anybody has actually tried to read philosophy papers on academic sites, sometimes you kind of can't see the forest through the trees, right? You just can't really see, where is he taking this? What does it mean? What are the implications? Somewhat similar to what Wade was actually doing when he had studied Matthew and he found that one particular piece, right? And so I know one thing that I do for my own edification when I'm trying to read is I self-learn, and I teach myself things. So when I'm stuck and I don't know an answer, I'll keep digging around. If there's an article or a paper that I don't quite understand, I'll just spend more time trying to understand it. And usually I can get a pretty good idea. Anyways, my point is about Robert Hanna's paper on dignity is that it does seem really wonderful to have dignity, to give dignity, to recognize dignity as an inalienable right, right? But I think the issue that I'm having with it from a philosophical standpoint is it still seems to be ill-defined what dignity is. And in Kant's foundations of moral ethics, of morality, metaphysics, he makes the point that dignity is anything that you cannot pay a price for. Right? So this kind of gets you thinking. It's like, really? So you got to kind of think about that, right? And then in this one particular paper where he's talking about dignity, and this is Robert Hanna now, he gives an example of, and I'm not getting the words, I'm paraphrasing it, and I think that the nuance of the quote is actually important. But effectively, it's if you were going to be summarily beheaded in a public execution for the purpose of, or for the reason of sexual orientation, they say gender, not sexual orientation, but gender, color of your skin, and these types of things, right? That they would ask that question if you could give your permission for that, right? And so, or if you would agree with that. And so basically the answer is no. This is in the paper. He's saying, no, that's not the case. That is not the case. No one would ever agree to being beheaded, right? And I'm looking at this going, this is one of the smartest men on the planet, writing this as an example, as a counterexample, trying to debunk dignity. And I was like, really? That's the best example you can come up with? But number one, a beheading is like something horrific, right? Something absolutely horrific. And I thought of a Titanic defense. You imagine Titanic is going down and all of a sudden we realize we're all on the ship and we're three males. Well, what is it that makes us decide that the males are going down with the ship and the females are going to get into the life rafts? What is that? What is that? We can characterize it, right? But it's something. And I can willfully give my own life in an example of a based on my sex, purely because I'm male. Jafar, I'm male. Wade, you're male. We're like, women and children get in the life rafts. I can make that choice, and it's a virtuous one. So, I I kind of was like, wait a minute. So this is the example. This is the best example on a foremost article on dignity. I was like, wow, we're kind of lost sheep here, right? I mean, maybe we're just goats, but something doesn't seem like you're following the right direction, dude, because you're lost. That cannot be the best example of, right? And these are our scholars.
Well, I'll add a slight tangent to that to kind of reinforce the perhaps wisdom or importance of it, and that is the concept of martyrdom within religion, right? Similar, right, to sacrificing one's life as a male for the women. And in fact, on that point, there's scripture that says the husband is the head of the wife, and this is interpreted often in terms of a male arrogance, and the wife has to submit. But the reality is, when Paul makes that statement, he then continues to say, as Jesus was the head of the church, who gave himself for it, right? So Jesus voluntarily went and was crucified in order to save his church, if you will, and all of humanity, right? Sacrificed himself for the sins of others. So there's this idea of sacrifice and martyrdom in religion as well. And I wonder if that helps in any way or not with this idea, because I'm also struggling with the specific context of using it to explain dignity, but I get the sense that there's something there.
Something in dignity that relates back to
well, so forget about the heading. Somebody standing on principle and says, take my life if you will, but I will not give up my dignity. Now, that could be just some kind of hubris and arrogance, or it could be genuinely willing to die for a principle that is the essence of dignity.
You know what? Here's why I think my philosophy is the best. Because this is Looney Toony. This is really Looney Toony, honestly, because I'll go back to the 4 cardinal virtues, okay? And let me just get them up here because I always forget one. Okay, so cardinal virtues are the 4 virtues of mind and character in both classical philosophy and Christian theology. They are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Okay? So I want to tell you a little heuristic here, okay? And you guys are God-fearing, loving people, so you know all about heuristics. The only thing you need to look at with those 4 virtues are there are things that you can work towards and strive for. They're virtues in themselves, right? I'm like, how do I practice dignity? What does that mean? How do I become a more dignified person? How do you do that? So to me, it's like, it doesn't fall under those 4 cardinal. Means it's like you gotta seriously look at it as being suspect, right? And I'm not against dignity. I'm against using dignity as something foundational in a document that is supposed to have our society shape around, right? And I'm not against everything in terms of intention that this document was designed to do, but sometimes our best laid intentions and designs don't work, and they don't work for particular reasons. And so if there's ambiguity around dignity, then what does that mean? It means...
Well, and I don't disagree at all. So in the interest of time, would there be a suggestion of a different word? Now, obviously, this took 3 years of, the nations coming together to work on it. Puts you on the spot a little bit. I'm not trying to do that. But is there another word or collection of words that you would wish to insert there? All human beings are born free and equal in blank and rights, or would we just say in rights, or in...
No,
how could one encapsulate...
in the context of the way they have it, I'd leave it. It's bound by the words that surround it, and I can't Dignity goes together with rights, probably fairly nice. I think nicely. I think I can improve upon it, which seems weird. It just doesn't. I just don't know how I can improve upon it.
Right. No, I hear you and understand you. I mean, and I appreciate the discussion. So the second part of the sentence is, particular of interest to me. This again ties it into religion, right? Well, because of certain concepts that are particularly emphasized in Christianity, and again, that's my lens, right? Historically, should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood.
Why can't they say friendship?
Well, yeah, especially when the first brothers listed in the Bible were Cain and Abel, right?
I just and in a spirit of, what does that mean? I don't know, right? I'm a philosopher. When I'm looking at that, I want to know how they're using spirit. What is it based on, right? Is it like, what are they talking about? You
could in a sense substitute spirit for attitude, or attitude for spirit.
Attitude, really? Attitude? I mean, anybody that has a spirit knows that it's more than an attitude.
Well, I don't think this is intended in terms of transcendent spiritual, personally.
Right. Okay. In the nature, yeah, I don't know. It just, you see how it gets a little weird, right? Like, yeah. I understand spirit as probably being the best choice of word, even though we realize that it's muted, I guess, for probably universal buy-in, right? Like, I don't know. It just seems.
Well, the other thing, yeah, it's universal buy-in, but also universal applicability. The more specific you get, the harder it is for it to be universally applicable.
I wanted to give this to Steven Pinker, and I'll say, can you rewrite this in a way that's, because he's written a book on clarity and stuff, like, just write it in a way that it's just explicit, right? Or what's the best way to write this?
Well, and, I don't know that the intent here was to parse the words, but rather the sentiment that is being discussed here. I mean, there's a similarity to, probably a number of constitutions that were written, certainly the U.S. Declaration of Independence that we've talked about, which preceded this, by what, 150 years? And other nations since then had adopted similar approaches, right? Definitely, it's the starting point, right? Establishing basic human equality, basic the sanctity of the nature of being human versus a rock, a tree, or even an animal.
Yeah. No, it's a great article. Like, actually, it's, as much as I'm criticizing it, you think, they're emphasizing that they're born to be free. Okay, you're born, which is fine, but it doesn't say that you have it your entire life. But that's not necessarily the point. I think it's like, here are the conditions at birth. Everybody, when they're born, that's what they're given, right? Then society does whatever else to them. And then it goes in and say...
Which would be counter to the spirit of brotherhood, right? Because you don't enslave your brother. You don't strip him of his dignity. You don't strip him of his rights in any kind of arbitrary way.
Yeah, and it says should act towards one another, right? So it's right. Like, and should is a nice watchword for ethics. So should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Like, it's wise that you do this. You know what I mean? Like, you should really do this. This is the reason,
Well, unless you have something to add, Jafar, we'll proceed to the second article.
Well, I just want to say I like there's something transcendent about some of the words they use, and dignity gives this, to me, it gives me this sense of like nobility, or something more than respect, right? It's something higher than respect. It's like it's something spiritual or divine or noble. Like, there's a nobility to the word. I think somehow that might matter. I'm not sure. But.
Well, it's interesting. Like you bring it to that point and say dignity from that stuff, but like I'm very, like there's certain thing about me. Like I'm a human being, right? To say I am a human being and say, well, when is that being challenged in terms of the thought, right? So I hear a lot of dignity being challenged for maybe an old person's home or something, right? And you're saying, well, they're not being tended to with due care and respect, and effectively, it's really damaging to their dignity, right? And so, it's used in that way, right? It's used in that kind of way. It's also used right on the opposite end of the spectrum with dignity, like he's a very dignified state profession or politician. The way he carries himself, and this kind of thing.
Well, it's coming out of World War II, so they're looking at the way that the Jews and other people were treated.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's like to view someone in the way that the Nazis viewed the Jews is I think what they're pressing up, what they're trying to go against.
Yeah. Well, and here's the horrific nature of going against something like Nazism. It has unintended consequences, and this may represent a subtle form of coercion.
Well,
Well, just in terms of the orthodoxy, right? You're saying there's nothing in this document that you cannot find in the Bible. And if everybody just followed the Bible from an orthodox standpoint and gave no credence to this, the world would be a better place, right? So does this represent progress? Does this, in what Wade's perspective, is a manifestation of something that was foretold in the Bible? Very interesting. But you can
I see it as an expression of human consciousness. Like it's like the Bible aside, it's like a grassroots expression of human learning in 1948 based on everything that we had done and all the mistakes we had made. So this is like, hey, we learned this thing. This is our best attempt at articulating it, however imperfect it may be. So it's not top down. It's not God saying do this, do this, do this. It's people saying, man, we've learned what not to do. Let's codify it, and let's hold it above everyone, and then let's take this thing and raise it up above every single being and institution on the planet, and agree to for it to be above us all.
How's
So
that
it's like
different than the Bible?
well, to jump in on this issue of coercion for a moment, I think the coercion comes later when this is established as law and applied to people who did not opt into it, right? Which has not happened. Because this is an opt-in approach in that nations signed on to it. Now, in a sense, you could be ostracized from the Fellowship of Nations, but this is like, on a grand scale, the club rules, right? This is what you sign up. If you're going to comment on this Facebook page, the moderator, may insist that you adhere to these guidelines, but you don't have to be on that Facebook page.
But we have to be on this planet, right?
Well,
So
yes,
everybody
but
has these rules
this,
to play by, right?
and if your nation signs on to it, right, then what recourse do you have? But largely, this is composed of democracies. And so, in theory, it's a majority. And in theory, these rights give you, or these articles give you the ability to retain a different opinion and even work towards that different viewpoint being expressed. If you really took exception to the word dignity here, you could make it your life's mission to get this article updated.
Oh, right. No, for me, it's, and I'm a bit of that anomaly, right? Like, I want to really understand what dignity means philosophically, what it means, where it's deriving from, right? And when there's a colleague, another philosopher that's written on it, then I want to really understand what he's trying to do there. And I'm just surprised by and I'm not finished my investigation, but I'm just surprised.
Well, perhaps we can hear next week of any new insight on that. I want to go ahead and move on to the next article.
And rights. No discrimination.
So clearly they're jumping over these, and they were about to mention Article 3. But everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set in this declaration without distinction of any kind: race, color, sex, language, religion, political, etc., etc. And they summarize it here. What did she say? No prejudice. I'm going to go back and replay that word.
No discrimination.
No discrimination. Applicable to everybody. Any thoughts or comments about the second article of no discrimination?
Well, I wonder if you would see a potential hypocrisy in this way, because let's look at sex, color, race, language, religion, political, or other opinion. I think you're okay with those, right? My intuition says you're all right with that. But then all of a sudden, if you saw sexual orientation in there, you'd probably flip a lid there, right? So
Wrong, because because the rights of that individual would still be preserved.
Okay.
I might personally believe that that person is making an unfortunate choice,
I see.
but
And your
but
other
that the
rub-
person has the freedom to do so.
Right, and your other rub would be that as a society we're encouraging, and that's the point where you get.
That would absolutely be true, especially especially when things become coercive in terms of, let's say, in forcing an orientation, right? Or forcing the exploration of an orientation. Because really it comes down to the fact that, look, I have an 11-year-old. And I don't believe, and I don't want that 11-year-old to be encouraged to explore these issues in a safe space away from his parents at age 11.
Yeah.
Right? I believe that that person should be provided the safe space of childhood to not have to explore such things that are perhaps politically and ideologically motivated.
Yeah.
And I believe that to be an imposition against the rights of the child and the parent up to a certain age. This document has not yet, it's getting into it a little bit here, to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or any other limitation of sovereignty, right? So now you get a lot of what may seem on the surface to be legal mumbo-jumbo, but which actually does seek to describe the various structures, legal structures, that have been agreed to at different places and for different reasons around the planet. Different specific local circumstances in which these individuals who have these universal rights find themselves. For example, I'm aware, and I want to study into this if anybody listening or anyone here has more information, the status of the indigenous peoples of the United States, the First Nations as they're called often, what they did and did not have or were given or granted, the dignity that they were or were not given with regard to the League of Nations. And then there was, and I've read this somewhere in some vague way, and I don't know the quote, but the situation was then different when the United Nations was established. There was an additional level of dignity that was granted to those peoples, those First Nations. And that if there is ever, frankly, one of the issues that I have with the United Nations, just to cut to the chase, is that I believe that that those who are currently administering judgment on this issue of human rights. The Human Rights Council are in fact some of the worst violators of human rights, and thus the thinking and the speaking and the acting of the United Nations has become corrupt on this issue. And at some point, either this gets cleansed, they talk about drain the swamp in America of the federal government. Well, some of that may or may not be needed at the United Nations. Or eventually the United Nations must somehow be changed or altered. We've also got the Security Council with its veto rights of certain nations. So the United Nations may not be the final arrangement, structure, or formulation of the collective will of the nations of this planet. And if and when there's a change, the rights of indigenous peoples, First Nations, and other collective groupings of identity may need to be addressed in some different way than they are now, as well as the issue of religious freedoms of belief within those constructs, to where the expression of a religious belief may or may not be, categorized as hate speech, right? So, it's not yet perfect or final. And we're already getting, we talked about the word dignity, but here with this discrimination, we're raising all kinds of questions. But no, I absolutely have no problem with acting without discrimination, period, end of story. Some of the issues that we see going on in the culture wars of America, to me, have less to do with one's particular ideology and more to do with the hypocrisy of how one side believes they can express their views versus letting the other side express their views because of this issue of setting oneself up in judgment and seeking to coerce the rights and the freedom of speech or expression, the deplatforming, all of those kinds of issues that can happen. So it's truly acting without discrimination that certainly we haven't mastered yet. And I'll just stop there before I ramble further or dig myself a deeper hole on anything I've said. Let you guys respond.
What do you think, Jafar?
I would just wonder if, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should be something that's not ideological. It should be as unideological as possible, because the purpose would seem to be to protect humans, whereas ideologies would promote ideas, right? So it's putting the human being above that of ideologies, which was the problem in World War I, among other times, when an ideology becomes more valuable than a human life. So hopefully, I feel like one of the purposes of it would be to preserve, let's say, dignity of the human individual above and beyond any particular ideology. And so then the question is, do each one of these articles achieve that?
Well, I was reading some of the information about the adoption of the final version of this, and some of the member states were providing input. And for example, there was an input on the issue of marriage and the freedom to marry as one wishes. And there was a member state, this one happened to be a Muslim state, that was discussing how some of those things would run counter to the tenets of their religion, right? And thus you have that crux, that impasse on some of these points where to enforce a certain standard might in other ways impinge upon the freedom and dignity. You follow me? So it's hard.
So, but they're enforcing their ideas about religion, people who are not members of the religion, right? Presumably.
Well, exactly. That's like, so the members of the religion were saying, well, we don't have a problem with this unless you come and try to insist that we adopt a standard internally that we don't agree with. And, again, this boils down to the subtext of this, right? The role of religion in society. And this is really the most important, fascinating part to me about this whole discussion is in a society where ideals become the norm, right? Let's say it's a religious ideal. In this case, it's a non-religious. It's the expression of a universal declaration of human rights. But let's say there was a religion called the religion of human rights, right? And now this religious belief, as encompassed by this document, this religious document, if this were a religious document, now seeks to become, the cultural law of the land, and everyone has to conform to it. And yet there are those who are a religion of the other document, and they say, well, we disagree with Article 14, right? We don't think Article 14 is correct. And by the time you get through 30 of these articles, you're probably going to find one that you say, well, I'm not so sure about that one. You follow me? And then who gets the right to establish that as a religious tenet and enforce it? So it's this balance of the adoption of certain cultural standards and norms without becoming coercive that is, to me, fascinating. And how that all gets architected. Really, it's about the architecture of it, which this document represents the beginning phases of an architecture. It has not yet been, solidified. The cement hasn't dried because there's no force of law. Indeed, those who lament the lack of progress globally against the articles in this document often cite it is the lack of an authority to enforce it that is the reason why we haven't made more progress. Therein the rub.
Yeah, and if the document requires enforcement, then by design, it's coercive. I mean,
Right.
Like it doesn't have, it can't be fully actualized without being coercive. And, I'm not saying forever it would be that way, but for right now, like whatever this point in history and time, it just simply doesn't work. Right, and that brings me back to my earlier point when I was talking about practicing virtues. I don't know how to practice dignity. I don't take away people's dignity, but I don't know. I just don't. I know it's a little bit silly, but
well, I think we can all point to examples of where that is not the case, but where is the line, right? I stepped in and watched the end of a movie with my daughter a little earlier called Clueless. My daughter's 14, and this was a teen movie, and there was a bride throwing a bouquet of flowers, and there was, hilarity ensues, right? There was a scene then of the various young ladies at the wedding scrambling to grab this bouquet, and they were not acting dignified. Their dignity was taken from them in that moment, or they lost their dignity because they were, flinging themselves bodily and on top of each other to grasp this bouquet, which symbolizes what exactly, right? And so there's just something cringeworthy about that scene that others may have found funny, and certainly in 1995 when the movie was made, but today, even then perhaps, but today perhaps more, it just was a cringeworthy scene that wasn't really all that funny to me.
It feels like almost an aesthetic, like dignity or nobility.
Well, these women were debasing themselves over something that was debasing them. It was taking away their dignity, the way in which they were portrayed as being, as acting in this movie, and whether or not that's really how young ladies acted, in 1995 at weddings or not. Well, it didn't, they lost a bit of dignity in that moment, if you will. And that's just, I could have come up with a billion other examples, but that was just the one that just literally I saw an hour ago. You could both probably imagine scenes where one's dignity is lost. I remember a horrifying moment when I was a junior in high school, and I was at this football game, and for some stupid reason, as I was walking down the bleachers, I grabbed this guy's baseball cap off his head, and I was a runt of a kid and had been bullied myself. And the other kid got mad, and in that moment, I realized I had bullied him, right, and I had taken away his dignity by, just jerking his cap off his head when I walked by, and I was horrified at what I had done in that moment. In that sense, I did not treat him with dignity in that moment because I, forcibly jerked this cap off his head. A tiny little example, but you follow me. There's these things that we could do that violate that first article. And of course, we know that the aggregate of those little acts do damage and hurt people and cause ripple effects throughout society that are negative. And by adhering to treating each other with dignity and recognizing the inherent sanctity of being human, we perhaps raise the standard up rather than tearing it down.
It's another Franssonism.
And we are out of time in terms of our hour. So I think we'll continue with a few of these. We'll perhaps tee a few of them up and try to dig in with some forethought going forward. But what last comments, Sir Jafar or Sir Daniel, do you have as we wrap up for the night?
I would just say, and then I'll pass the mic over to Jafar. I would say I'm really not critical of the document. It's just, if you're seeking to understand something, I'm trying to display a good way to exercise your reason and your critical thinking and thinking about things in a more contemplative way, more philosophical way. So that's it.
I mean, I agree. I also think, I don't know, I'm thinking a little bit more about the language and how certain words can be used to inspire and uplift and kind of create, a sense of an aesthetic of nobility or majesty or courtliness that inspires people to be better, or even to their inner life. They don't want to think things that are, say, unseemly, because they aspire to be this dignified person or something. I know that sounds kind of. I think that the document maybe was also meant to do that, to inspire people to be better. And I feel like language like that might add to it. I don't know. It's just a hypothesis.
I do like that, especially, this show being titled Created in the Image of God, right? Elevating the human spirit to be and become the highest expression of itself. And as individuals, but also the aggregation of that in a society that brings forth an ever higher level of the expression of what it means to be human in a positive way. I think my life has really been dedicated to that in terms of coming from a rather difficult and dark place and having to overcome a lot of baggage and a lot of barriers and having to relearn and train just to achieve a level of decency that was not really present in my earliest years, right? So to talk about the concept of privilege for a minute, wherever that privilege comes from in your culture and in your experiences and what you end up being, the circumstances of your birth. Because that first article says born with, right? But guess what? Many people are actually not born with those things. There are millions, if not a billion people that are not born, they're literally not born free and equal in dignity and rights. So that is an expression, an aspirational expression. All beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Oh yeah, really? Go tell that to the entire citizenship of certain countries.
Yeah.
Right? It's not true. And yet it's not intended to be a statement of fact. It's intended to be a statement of aspiration. We must work towards making this true. And the only way we get there is, by working on ourselves in our communities locally. I don't think we get there by preaching. I don't think we get there by, berating other people, by declaring other people to be non-conforming to this. To your point, Daniel, we have to understand what it means to behave with dignity, and we don't. We don't know what that means, and we can't even express it. And we haven't yet figured out how to create a system that enshrines these principles without being coercive. Because the minute we become coercive, we become part of the problem, not part of the solution, in my view, in my estimation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. Like, how does somebody improve their dignity? It feels very much like a liberal tradition hand down law, or like somebody handing you a law. When people don't really understand what it means, when you use the most horrific examples like Nazi Germany in the context of when this, you put this into a historical context, that's fine. Actually, you know what? Everyone just nods their head and they go, yes, that was a horrific time.
Right.
But you realize, what if a word like that does cause problems down the road? I mean,
right.
I can't anticipate how it would cause problems, but like Wade, you were saying, people are not born that way. So then, do the rulers of countries say no and enforce it and fight about it? And I just don't see that. I mean, I see the strife right now between countries saying, climate change is a perfect example. If you notice that
oh no, here we go. No, go ahead.
No, but the war on climate change, right? It's a broad sweeping. We want everybody to do this. Now, I'm not going to take it down, as the way somebody might think I'm just going to kind of steer this. Like, it's not a common response to look at the climate change narrative and say something like, maybe it's just not, or if we were to do it in a non-coercive way, in a more natural way, wouldn't you think it would be something that the conservative government would be nurturing along? Like, this is supposed to be a political party of, protecting the way things ought to be, the way things are. Tradition. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could all have family dinners and keep this kind of lifestyle as much as possible, right? Okay? And so if the science was irrefutable, that this is what's going on, wouldn't that side of the aisle actually go, yeah, I guess we should do something about that, right? However, if the wisdom behind it is that, well, shit's going to hit the fan, and, if you happen to be in a privileged part of the world, then so be it. And if billions of people die, I don't know. I'm going to church every Sunday, and that's just the way it is. Like, I can't do that. I can't take on that responsibility. But I can put my faith in God, and I can say that, right? And I can say that the authority figure that I believe in is the Lord, and things will work out, because they always will. Right? There's that approach. And you say, where's the wisdom in that approach? Well, the wisdom in that approach is trying not to like architect all of society all around the globe. Don't meddle with it. You're going to fuck it up. That's the wisdom, right? Or knowing that in our nature we are still tribal. And when it really comes down to crunch time, you're just not going to share. It's not going to happen.
It would be wonderful if there was a massively powerful simulation that was an exact replica of the world. And anyone who had these ideas could go in and program into the simulator, right? And see the horror that would result if their ideas were actually adopted and actually implemented.
Yeah.
Right?
Despite best intentions, right?
Right. Imagine a little toddler, right? Being allowed to, walk into the world championship Lego expedition. And and start messing with the Lego structures, right? And just bringing them down one after the other because, I want to move this here. It's kind of like that, right? We are so woefully, any one of us, so woefully inadequate of really understanding the complexity of human society. And if you had that divine power to say, well, why doesn't God just this? Or this is the old school, right? Rant against religion. Well, if there's a God, then why doesn't he this? Or why doesn't he that? Because if he did this or that, you'd see how that would work out. Right? Whatever it is that your idea is that what God should be doing, heaven help us if you ever had godlike powers.
Yeah. Unintended consequences, right? And so your little alarm bell is anywhere there's coercion. That's a sign of that's an alarm bell that it's not natural.
Well, you think about the great world's religious leaders, even somebody like Gandhi, right? Look at Gandhi's life and how subtle was his approach, right? And
he's
today,
the quintessential example, right? But what I'm,
right.
What about leaders that actually had to go into battle and lead men into to fight for a culture they believed in, right? There's a bit of evolution in that. I would say dominant cultures get destroyed, and I think that's a really interesting thing where they say, I know my studies on cultural evolution really started to come into focus when I realized, when do they get extinguished? When's the extinction event happen for a culture? And then you can start to understand what a culture is from beginning to end.
Did Nero actually fiddle while Rome was burning, right?
Yeah. So, but what are there some cultures that may have been kind of lost in the last 3,000 years, and for what reason does the Greek culture keep pulling through from its origins and from the Aegean Sea? You even say there's something from the Judaic religion that says, hey, actually we're the only one that's still left standing with an actual living culture. Right, spoken culture and book and stuff like that, right? From that particular period of time. We're so old and ancient, there's got to be something about the Jews that just makes sense, right? Or, because they're the chosen people, right? Or something about
it's fascinating, right? Especially when you consider that the language had all but died out. And I remember reading some article recently about whether it was somebody went and got a bus ticket that was printed in Hebrew, and it moved him to tears because, the language was all but dead, and the people that went to Israel, they didn't speak Hebrew, 70 years ago. Right? There was, you follow me? It was, and yet they've, you could say, just leave God out of it, that people has willed into existence it was an article about the little nation that could or something, right? And then you get, because of the exceptionalism of that fact, you get those who, you know, want to imply all kinds of conspiratorial negative things about it. But the truth is, it's an exceptional example of something.
Yeah, and it unfolds without coercion, and that's, you know, again, we can get in trouble, say there's no coercive activities in that, you know, from that population or group, but that's not the case. In itself, the rule is kind of like the example of David and Goliath. It's like David's small man overcoming was actually, you know, the spirit that defined that wisdom. And, you know, that's fascinating. I mean, I would love it if there was a natural way to get everybody incented to read ancient Greek. You can imagine that?
Right.
Like we kind of just
Yeah,
return
absolutely.
and we're all speaking ancient Greek and, you know, walking around with, you know, Hellenized city names and just, yeah, I mean.
Well, every now and then, you know, you could go to a toga party, maybe.
Yeah, well,
At least in the 70s.
Totally different way of life with men and boys, right? Like, holy
Right.
jeez, that's
Right.
gonna. It's like the pedophiles take over and
Right.
and cleanse themselves of all wrongdoing and do it for friendship. You know, this kind of thing, right? That's crazy. It's really crazy. That's one thing I can't. Well, no, I can get my mind around. Not the pedophilia, but the, you know, all of the real strong male relationships that are actually. You know, like they'll say in one, I'm not sure what, which of the dialogues it was, but Socrates kind of caught a glimpse of the young guy's manhood, and he got excited. And he's like, oh, you know, it's like, oh, what the, that doesn't happen. That wouldn't happen to me, right? You know, I mean, but can you imagine that just was a totally different way of thinking.
The Olympics, for example, right? Yep. Well, not necessarily the note we had wanted to end on. What I want to do, as discussed a few minutes ago, when we come back, we'll dig back into some of those and continue the discussion. Jafar, Daniel, really appreciate your participation as always. And looking very much forward to continuing down the topic of how this Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ideals as defined in 1948 by the United Nations might provide additional insight into how the topic of being created in the image of God and discussing the role of religion in society might improve the way in which we as a species evolve over time. So thanks for joining us, and looking forward very much to seeing you all again here next week, same time, same place. Please do like and subscribe, and we'll see you at 8 o'clock Central Time, 9 p.m. Eastern Time next Tuesday night.
Thanks.